Hey, welcome to Live America podcast. This is Hatem. Noam is away, unfortunately, this week. Amazing guest. Always love to have him, especially in tough times like this, because he really laid off the right way. Our guest is returning of Natan Sachs. He is the director of the Center of the Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute. Good to have you.
Hatem, it's always good to see you, even in terrible times.
Yeah, yes, it's crazy. So, the President Donald Trump proposed that the United States take over and own the Gaza Strip for long term. And right now, everybody's kind of like struggling. I know we did an episode maybe 5,000 years ago about the day after. Still, I don't know what's going on. Everybody's struggling for a solution. But where do you see let's talk about Trump's suggestion first and thinking outside the box as what was your initial reaction and what's the reaction in Israel and the Middle East in general?
So I think the reaction in Israel and almost everywhere else is very different. Um, Across the board, it's stunning. It's complete. Outside the box is an understatement. This is a complete change in every single way. Um, it has, so let me start by saying very clearly, I'm very strongly opposed um, on moral and practical grounds, but I also think it has a very, very low chance of success. That said, let me start by why I think it holds appeal. So, for some, very few. So, in Israel, this echoes opinions that were heard on the very far right in Israel for many years. But when I say very far right, the person who was the biggest advocate of it in the 1980s, let's say, was a violent racist against Arabs. When the prime minister at the time was Netanyahu's predecessor, as leader of the Likud party that Netanyahu now leads, when that man would speak in the Knesset, he was elected, the prime minister would step out of the plenary. He would not dignify that person with his presence. And it was the Likud party, Netanyahu's own party, a member of that party, that appealed to the Supreme Court to argue that this man must be barred from elections because what he presents undermines the idea of a democratic state. And he was barred. So he won one seat in 1984, but in 88 he was barred from running. One of his successors, an admirer of his, is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who until recently was minister, so-called of national security, but really of the police in Israel, and is now sort of out of the coalition, but he may return. Um, and these are the kinds of opinions that they espouse. And so now, when you have Trump, the president of the United States, saying basically transfer ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, for the Israeli far right, this is day of celebration. And for many in the Israeli center right, it's hard for them to be more Catholic than the Pope. So if the President of the United States says, look, I have a solution, and by the way, it would solve Israel's interminable Gaza problem, it's hard for them to say no. Um, there's another reason it rings appealing. First, it's out of the box, and of course, this is a terrible problem, and that has some appeal, I think, for many. But the other is that there is a genuine question, a real problem of what do hundreds of thousands, more than 1 million Palestinians in Gaza do with so much destruction and with how long it would probably take to rebuild the Gaza Strip. So for many people, the obvious thing is they should have refuge elsewhere. And by the way, that is true. They should have the option to have refuge elsewhere. Where Trump is different from that, or what he's proposing, is first he's not talking about an option. He's talking about removing them. That's a very different thing. And second, he's talking about them not being allowed to return. So it's not that they would find refuge elsewhere, we rebuild it, or someone rebuilds it, and then they can return. He is talking about removing them forcefully. Then the United States takes ownership of the Gaza Strip, and asked repeatedly, even a week later, why would they want to return? Um, so now let me touch on something else and how it's the reaction in the region. And I think there's an interesting point here to make. If we were talking simply about any people in any war zone, then one of the first things people would demand is that they be allowed refuge elsewhere. That Egypt, for example, that borders the Gaza Strip, and and Hamas controlled that border for a long time until Israel took it over. That Egypt, for example, allow Gazans in big numbers to take refuge. But here, and you can speak to this better than I can, but in the Arab world, and I'd love to hear your take on this. The Arab world, the Palestinian national cause is a huge issue among broad publics, and this touches, and so therefore, the idea of displacement of Palestinians or even of refuge for Palestinians, for more Palestinians, um, and especially in countries like Egypt and even more so Jordan, is a third rail because there's a feeling that if they leave, they will not be allowed to return, like in 1948, and therefore that this would be a betrayal of the Palestinian national cause and of their chance of having a future. And for Egypt, and even more so for Jordan, it's also a domestic issue. Egypt has had, for many years, now less, a very extensive campaign, especially in the northern Sinai Peninsula, which borders the Gaza Strip, with a lot of unrest. And Sinai is huge compared to Gaza in terms of territory, but actually not in terms of population. So if Gaza opens up to the northern Sinai, that becomes a major national security issue for Egypt, which is very hostile to groups like Hamas, the regime in Egypt is. And in Jordan, where probably most of the population is of Palestinian descent, millions of Palestinians entering would be hugely destabilizing. It is the core sort of domestic national issue and cleavage of Jordan is the question of East Bankers versus West Bankers, of Jordanians of Palestinian descent and other Jordanians. And to add a huge number to a small country would undermine the stability of Jordanian demography, of economy, of monarchy, which is, of course, what they care about. All this to say, from the regional perspective, it's a non-starter. And there have been those who argue that President Trump, as he does, he puts out a dramatic proposal and then he's willing to negotiate it. And of course, that can sometimes work. The problem is if your initial proposal is so outlandish and so impossible for the other side to swallow, there's not much negotiation to be had. So it could produce pressure on the Arab states to come up with their plan, and that would be a good thing. But for them to seriously negotiate this kind of thing, it's just a non-starter. That's kind of my take. This is setting aside. I started with this, but just to return, there's an international law question. There's a moral question. Gaza is a Palestinian territory. Could be decided otherwise by Palestinians and others, but if the United States to simply take it over, would turn into legal issues. And from a moral perspective, you don't simply displace 2 million people without their possibility of returning to their homes, even if the homes are destroyed and something very real has to be done about it. That's kind of my short take. It's not so. In short, I think it's immoral, but I think it's also impractical. Let me add one last point. Sorry, Lindsey Graham, who's a very senior, of course, and seasoned Republican senator from South Carolina, and a very influential voice in foreign policy matters. Really, one of the most influential voices. He sort of said, almost coyly, he doesn't know many South Carolinians. I'm paraphrasing. Much appeal for South Carolinians, his constituency, for sending troops to take over the Gaza Strip. And that's from a senior Republican senator who's in the past at least been close to Trump. So I don't see it happening, to put it mildly.
I agree with you 100% in almost everything. You know, and that's the thing that worries me when people get involved in the Middle East that don't understand the Middle East, that don't understand the history, that don't understand, I'll just add one more thing to that is I think it drives more people towards violence, towards Hamas, towards, a solution because when you're so desperate and you see the biggest power in the world saying, "Oh, we're just gonna take it," I mean, it's obviously ridiculous. The good thing that comes from it is maybe it's that for me it's very I think it's very important that the Arab world and the Middle East need to finally understand that their future is only in their hands. They have to be the key players, not depend on somebody else, either the United States or Europe or whatever, to make peace, or to be like key negotiate. They need to be the ones that do this, the Arab world specifically, the Palestinians need to elect a leader. And this is, I think, one of the most important things for me that I always say that lacking in the Palestinian cause is like you need a true leader that comes out, represent the people, represent the most of the Palestinians that I know, and I'm sure and a lot of people know that don't want any of this, don't want to be part of Hamas, don't want to be part of the violence. They want to live their lives, but they need a leader. The Arab world's and Saudi Arabia is doing a great job in that, you know. Egypt is a little bit, I think also from the Israeli side need a true leader that understands, the long-term security of Israel is just like before, it's all with peace, because you creating not only a lot of like people that gonna be okay, there's no solution to Arab world, but a lot of right side like within Israeli community as well, and that's not good. They never been like that.
Yeah, and I think this really normalizes these ideas in Israel. It's very hard to argue that this is, once the president of the United States says a thing like this, it's very hard to argue that these kind of ideas, to point out just how outlandish and immoral they are. And to push your point, not to put this is my point, not yours. There is also an hypocrisy. There's a lot of hypocrisy on the Israeli side of the Palestinian issue. Of course, they want to get the Palestinians out of there. It's not so much about the Palestinian welfare, but it also is on the Arab side. The insistence that Palestinians, in a sense, individually not be allowed refuge because of the national cause and because of what this says or because of the other states, they are the ones paying the price.
Yeah,
And this is not to say the Palestinians would want a Trump plan. Of course they don't. But in these many 16 months, is it? They should have been allowed some kind of refuge in Israel, but also in Arab states and elsewhere. And they're not in part, and it's seen as obvious that they're not. There's been no demonstrations demanding, let them have refuge somewhere, because of the Palestinian national cause, because it's seen as letting Israel off the hook, which I think really, not that you have to own what I said, but I think really it echoes what you're saying about they have to take matters into their own hands, and it has to be a productive, constructive way. We're now 16 months later. There's no serious day after plan,
yeah,
and you get this vacuum. So Trump comes with this, and that's very much on Israel too. I mean, I think we talked about it last time. I think one of the biggest failures of Netanyahu in these many long months is not only not coming up with a plan, but shooting down any attempts within the Israeli system to come up with some kind of not awful day after plan, because it involved the Palestinian Authority in particular. And that's true for the Arab side too. The Egyptians who are neighbors but also have enormous sway, and others, the Qataris, everyone else, have not offered any serious day after plan, except essentially going back to what was before: Hamas in control or partial control, eventually fighting Israel, digging in again, and just waiting for round
yeah,
100.
yeah. And back to the point where like a lot of people in making the policies in the Middle East don't understand the Middle East. The thing with Egypt and opening the border, if you go back to the relationship between the current government and Hamas, it's very bad. I mean, during the revolution, Hamas did a lot of damage in Egypt, so they have no trust. So it's like a secure, like if they would let revs, they will be like, okay, Hamas is gonna come in, we're gonna cause more trouble. And Hamas, by the way, at a certain point, they wanted to take over Sinai as well, during the Muslim Brotherhood, and make like camps there, and then as a point of attack on Israel. And when you see Hamas, they say in interviews in the Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya or all even like CNN, they was like, oh, we'll be out, we will have nothing. And then you see them giving the hostages with all this, commercialize and promotion for themselves. Like if you really care about the Palestinians people, why are you showing that much that you are in power, knowing that you're not, but it's going to be used? It's like, hey, look, they're still in power. So there's a
Yeah,
lot to be done,
and
but
it terrifies Israelis. I mean, if you want to make sure that the Israelis continue the war, it's proved that Hamas is still in charge. And you're exactly right. I mean, these images of the hostage release for Israelis are so ostentatious and so offensive, of course, that it really is a step in that direction. And Hamas won't be there, but there's no one else right now.
yeah,
I mean, besides Trump offering the United States, there's no one else to do it. The Palestinian Authority may not have been possible. I'm skeptical, but at least there was a chance with them. With with others, who else really is going to do it? And so it's a it really worries me a lot. And I think you're absolutely right. It's important to remember Hamas is an offshoot, literally an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And the Sisi regime came to power, I mean, specifically in opposition to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. That's exactly how it starts. It's overthrowing the Morsi regime. And so the
And
campaign in
during the
northern Sinai.
Mubarak thing, Hamas got into Egypt, opened the jails, and did all that, you know.
Exactly. And that was exactly the problem in Sinai, which for the Egyptians was an Egyptian issue, of course. So much so that at the time, even publicly, you would hear the Egyptian government, the Egyptian foreign minister, speak about cooperation with Israel in fighting in Sinai,
Yeah.
which is crazy to think that Israel was helping Egypt on Egyptian soil with unmanned aerial vehicles, something you'd never imagine could have happened. And Egypt was speaking about it openly.
Yeah, and
So
even
this was the
they were asking because of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, there's a certain
exactly.
amount of troops. They were asking Israel to give permission to give more troops so we can fight, you know, and they did.
Exactly, and they did,
Yeah,
and so it's a nightmare. And behind the scenes, there's Egypt. Egypt's in a very interesting position. I wonder what you take on it, because Egypt, on the one hand, there's this very strong anti-Hamas position and bias. On the other hand, Hamas ruled the Gaza Strip for 19 years, and because it's the neighbor, the one Arab neighbor of Gaza, it holds more sway than almost anyone. And it finds itself together with Qatar, which is close to Hamas, being the only one with real leverage and also brokering the negotiations and the ceasefire. But it's sort of caught in the middle. On the one hand, it has sway. On the other hand, it's partnering with Qatar, which is its rival, and dealing with Hamas, which is at least a rival, if not an enemy.
yeah.
And a very strange, very awkward position, I guess, for the Egyptians. But without them, nothing can be done
Yeah.
because they're there.
That's absolutely true. And you know, they are in a position, and I think this is all the people are paying the price for not solving this crisis long time and putting Hamas in power and weaken the and divide the Palestinian Authority, and that's including Israel policy
Hmm.
and the Arab policy, Arab world policy, and giving money to Hamas knowing what's going to happen, you know. And well, part of, in my opinion, that October 7th happened was, you know, because the relationship with Saudi Arabia and UAE, and it's getting closer to Israel, so they had to intervene somehow, you know. But you know, I think there have to be new players. I have to be new leaders all over. Like it have to be in Israel, somebody who's like really have a vision, and somebody, and before that, obviously somebody in the Palestinian world. And I always say it cannot be the return of somebody from before, from both sides. You cannot, because obviously nobody was able to solve that problem, you know. So somebody need to be like, hey, and now I think one of the things that Trump has did is that a lot of pressure. There's like, okay, this guy's crazy. We got to do something about it. But I don't know how much because this plan is so crazy. I don't know how many people actually believe that this is actually going to happen. I think he believes that it could happen. I think he believes it, but obviously it's not going, it just doesn't work. Um, but yeah, I think we have to use the leverage that we have. And for years and years, the leverage, everybody was, you know, the bombs, the tanks, the strength of the army, and that's important. But more important, the leverage of peace. You know, in Saudi Arabia, I think that's the most, you know, when you see how the area moved forward, was the first time was when Egypt made peace, moved
Yep.
a huge chunk, even though, you know, the rest of the Arab world, you know, didn't talk to Egypt for a while, and cut all the relationship. But then now they said, oh, I wish that was back and we could do all this, be part of that peace treaty. You know, now Saudi Arabia is moving that direction, but they're very clear about this. But you have to understand, you know, the Middle East. They have to understand Hamas. That, you know, that's Hamas is in the way of the Palestinian people of having anything, you know. I know some people may disagree, especially now, seeing that everybody's given up on the Palestinian people, and that's what fears. What my biggest fear is, people going to be pushed more towards is like, oh, you see, nobody cares about you except me, you know.
Yeah, and they sort of have this appeal in a vacuum, but like you say, I mean, it's not you can't ignore their ability to spoil and undermine things. From the Israeli perspective, really there is nothing that killed the peace process in the 90s more than Hamas.
Yeah,
It was the suicide bombings, we talk often of the assassination of Rabin in 95, but the truth is, I'm not sure Rabin would have won the election, to be perfectly honest, even if he had lived. And the main reason is that from the Israeli perspective, the signing of the peace was then followed by suicide bombings by Hamas before and after his assassination. And his assassin, a right-wing Israeli Jew, was even citing the suicide bombings as one of the rationales for it. Of course, Palestinians would also say the peace treaty or Oslo Accord, not treaty, but the Oslo Accord didn't stop settlements and many other things. That's also true. But from the Israeli perspective, what really undermined any confidence in Oslo was more than anything was the violence. And
Yeah.
there was a majority in Israel that was willing to give a chance. And so I'm just saying this not, I don't care who's to blame. My point is that Hamas is obviously not going to give that up and has proved that in October 7th. And so the question of how one dislodges them and how one allows a new leadership of some kind to have real sway and to have real power is a very difficult one. Hamas is much, much weaker now after all this war, but without empowering an alternative, without giving, for example, if you want aid that's going into the Gaza Strip, it's going to be distributed by whoever has any power, and that's going to be the remnants of Hamas, because they're the ones who have guns, or it could be local gangs or some local families, but mostly it's going to be Hamas. If you empowered a secular Palestinian actor, almost anyone, a secular Palestinian actor, to come in and distribute the aid, they would gain that kind of leverage. They would be able to start having some sway, having real assets. Instead, just moving it in and giving it to Hamas, it's of course needed, better than not, but that is to me just policy malpractice,
Yeah.
and one that people have been talking about since the beginning of the war. It's clear you have to destroy Hamas, and you have to build an alternative, as imperfect as it is, so that there's some chance of building otherwise, guess what? 16 months later, who is putting on these grotesque shows? It's going to be Hamas. That's all you have
Yeah.
left.
I've been saying, I know a lot of people may agree or disagree, but I've been using this example. It's like when you see the Israeli hostages coming out and you see them next to Hamas and they thanking Hamas, smiling, taking pictures, saying thank you so much, you guys are great, and smiling. And you know that they're just doing this because they have to survive. Why people don't give the same courtesy to the regular Palestinian people when they're next to Hamas? And they say, oh, they elected them, they love them, they're cheering for them. It's the exact same thing. They are hostages as well. They are under, the people have guns, people have the power to give the food, the electricity, the water, everything, you know. So yeah, they're weakened now. But and that's why there was a big flaws in Netanyahu's plan, which no secret, I don't like him, but get rid of Hamas. How are you gonna get rid of Hamas when you're negotiating with Hamas in Qatar? You gotta, they have to be in an internet, and this is what the one that I'm most disappointing with the whole world is like the number one thing is like we have to stop giving refugees to the leaders that think that they are terrorists or think that they're doing something and having their own people do the fight for them while they living in palaces and stuff like that. That should be the number one thing, you know. And I understand you have some people like can look at like, okay, Nelson Mandela at some point was this and now he become, I'm not talking about somebody like that or you have, a disagreement with in certain things. I'm talking about somebody constantly choosing violence against their own people and everybody else, So I think that's should be the first thing is like if they have no place to go, no money, they're gonna double think. But at the same time, all these people that were killed in Gaza, innocent people, have their kids, a mother, brother, and sister, all they're gonna do is they want vengeance. That's all they want to do. So you have to like it's a big, big, big situation, but it have to come from like a fair place. Which takes us to my next question is like now you're in charge. How do you think what is the plan? What could happen? Like yes, we have to think outside the box, but there's a lot of things outside the box, like having a Palestinian state, like having new leaders, like there's so much, like the peace between everybody in the Middle East, like no involvement for the United States. So what's your thoughts? What if you're responsible right now, if President Trump is like, hey, Mr. Sachs, do this for us, what would you do?
So he's not doing that. Let me just be perfectly clear. And I'm not in charge, and there's good reason for that too. Look, I think there was a lot of flaws in the Biden approach, but the overall vision for what might be possible, I don't think it was pursued vigorously enough, but the overall vision for what might be possible, I think was on the right path, which is to say that to bring relief to Gaza, you have to have several ingredients. One of them is regional involvement. And that's for several reasons. One, you have to have the political cover of Arab states that work with the United States and can work with Israel, and that Israel can trust more or less in
That's a
order
key
for there to
word,
be.
and I'll just add to it the only thing I'm gonna add to it publicly.
Yes, they can exactly. They can actually do that, and so that's not the Qataris long term. It's to a degree the Egyptians, but it's much more so. It's Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That's one, and two, money. Uh, Reconstructing Gaza, bringing back some kind of hope for those who are there, especially those who have lost so many, requires enormous funds, which the United States is not about to spend. It wasn't under Biden. It's definitely not under Trump. Europe is not about to do it. It has its own issues. There really is only one place that could do it, and that's the Gulf. Now, the Gulf is not, spending money like it used to. It's not just handing out cash like it used to. It thinks of it much more an investment. That's true in Egypt as well, but it thinks about things as investment. But with the right political circumstances, you could also have real investment. So, for example, this Riviera in the Middle East nonsense, it's not complete nonsense in the sense that you could build something quite terrific there with enough money and enough political cover and a security situation. It's something that Hamas or any other government could have done also in the last 15 years. So with that kind of leadership, you could do it. But you also need another ingredient, which we talked about already. You have to have a Palestinian counterpart, an organic Palestinian counterpart actor that can do it. And it cannot be Hamas. And realistically, it cannot be Abbas either. It can't be the official Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, partly because they are extremely illegitimate in the eyes of Palestinians themselves. They're also corrupt, but also they are not trusted by the Gulf. The Emiratis and the Saudis are not about to work through Abbas, certainly not the Emiratis, about to work through Abbas. So you need some kind of secular Palestinian actor, and there are many Palestinian businessmen, there are many Palestinian politicians even, who are not affiliated with Hamas, of course, who are secular, and could, they're not Muslim, but they're not affiliated with the Islamist groups, and that could have offered this. It would require a variety of different things. It would require Netanyahu to go along with a bunch of this. It would require courage on the Palestinian side for these actors. I think they exist, but it would be very hard and very risky. It would require courage on the Arab side. This, of course, could be in the biggest scheme of things, and what Biden was hoping for was that this would be part and parcel of Israeli-Saudi normalization, which for the Israelis is a real carrot. It's not as big as it was before October 7th because the Israeli fears after October 7th are profound. But nonetheless, if Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, whom the Israelis do trust more, are willing to be involved, and there could be Saudi-Israeli normalization, where Gaza and rebuilding it with a reinvigorated Palestinian leadership, all those are ingredients that do fit together. It's very, very hard to do. Netanyahu is very keen on Saudi normalization, but he's not keen on building a secular Palestinian political force. He's still wary of the idea that that would lead to a Palestinian state. And on the Palestinian side, we have not seen an alternative to Hamas come up. We see the Palestinian Authority still sclerotic, and which is a real impediment because for the Emiratis to act, for the most of the world to act with the Palestinians, they have to have the cover, the diplomatic cover of the official Palestinian Authority and of the PLO to say, we speak for the Palestinians. We, for example, invite the Emiratis or the Saudis to be in the Gaza Strip and be involved. So long as that's Abbas, it's very hard to see that happening. So I can tell you another 15 reasons why this won't work and 15 reasons why also it would fail even if we did it. The chances, of course, of success are not super high. But I do think that would have been the best chance. It would offer political cover, some kind of political horizon, and hope with pragmatic or at least productive actors that the Israelis can trust, that have the funds to push things forward, and that are not Hamas friendly. So not the Qataris, not the Turks. That's where I would try to push things.
Yeah.
It's very, very late. I mean, this should have been started, on day one. Of course, you have to think about the day after. When you start a war, the war is not, the military ends are important, but of course they are just a means towards diplomatic and political ends. That's, of course, the goal of every war. So this should have started from the very, very beginning, and that's something that Netanyahu refused to do. And also something that was not seriously done on the Arab side, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of waiting for Israel to come up with it.
Well, that's the thing is like I think Netanyahu will not allow any Palestinian leader to come out, but so is Hamas. They're not going to
Absolutely.
allow anybody,
No, they're going to fight tooth and nail.
And the
Exactly.
thing is like if the United States of any Western uh came up with someone that they negotiate with, they're gonna be known as a puppet for the West.
Mhm.
So they won't be trusted by the Palestinian people. The only thing is like it needs to be, I think, a current name that have a long history of fighting for the Palestinian cause peacefully, but known. And they have to come up with it. But like you
And
said,
with Arab backing. I mean, the Arab world, if it's not an American puppet and not an Israeli puppet, but someone that important actors in the Arab world, and of course Palestinians themselves, trust. It doesn't have to be the new ultimate leader of the Palestinians either yet, but it needs to be someone who can act organically as a Palestinian leader of sorts and be able to move things forward. Eventually, Abbas won't be there. Who knows how long, but eventually he won't be there. And if you are to replace Hamas, you would have to go along these kinds of routes. But I want to be clear, I don't think we're on a path there. I don't,
yeah.
both because of Netanyahu, but also because of Trump. I think the way he views this is different. You always have to hope he's the president. And so you have to hope that of what I think is a non-starter plan, and for good reason, you might see other things. His insistence that Hamas not be involved in the government the day after is, I think, a very good thing. And this kind of, he's crazy, we better come up with something that, like you said, I think is important, that can be an important move forward. It's worth remembering, I'm very, very, very critical of a lot of that Trump is doing elsewhere, in Europe and in the United States. But,
Yeah.
I'll tell you a big secret, I didn't vote for him. But in the Middle East, there are some advantages sometimes to someone who speaks more the language of some of the leaders of the Middle East. And in the
Yeah.
Middle East, the number of people who really decide matters is rather small. MBS, MBZ, Netanyahu, Erdogan, Khamenei, Sisi. That's most of the lists. There's not much else.
Yeah.
And Trump gets along with most of them, except Khamenei. And so there could be some hope of moving things, but you have to have an idea of where you're going. It has to be a realistic idea. It has to be done in partnership with allies. I do hope, I think, for example, I do think Saudi-Israeli normalization is not completely impossible.
Yeah.
I think the parties want it. Trump wants it. There are many reasons why it won't happen. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's impossible.
And at this point, I think I don't know if it have the same power and appeal that it did before October 7th, because before, that even like if you're being in Israel, you're looking for a future better thing. Now you want to be like, oh shit, I want to make sure nothing happened like this
Yeah.
again. So I don't care about the normalization, which is the exact same thing that the Arab wars were feeling years before that. It's like
Yeah.
I need to live right now. I don't care about normalization or anything, the exception of Egypt doing that. Uh, but yeah, I mean, like the leader have to come out, and that's another thing is like even if the leader comes out from Saudi or from Egypt, they're gonna say he's Egyptian puppet. It gotta be somebody who's like I said, known. But the other thing is like when you said, this is maybe the only one thing I disagree with you in this conversation so far is like when you said like, and that person doesn't have to be the leader later from the history of the Middle East. If a guy taking this over, come on, you think he's gonna be? Give me one example of somebody was the middleman until to take to the power and then give it to somebody else. I mean,
I don't think he's giving it up, but I do no. What I mean is more that I mean more that I'm not, we don't have to fix everything in one go because
yeah,
the situation is so bad right now. We have to find forces that can move it forward, and they don't have to be perfect. That's a lot of my point is that I don't have some perfect plan. I don't think anyone does. But we really need to accept imperfect so long as it's much better. And I'll add also that, when you think of the possibility of moving towards normalization, all that, you're exactly right. On the Israeli side, the appeal before October 7th was very big. This was the one big prize. Israel was kind of high on the Abraham Accords. Here was the Arab world opening up, really important actors that Israel cares about, UAE, Morocco, Bahrain too, but less so. But, and if Saudi Arabia couldn't join, and my impression is also that on the Arab and even Muslim side, so not only Arab states, Saudi Arabia holds such an important position as the home of the two holy mosques and the birthplace of Islam, that and a very big and of course extremely wealthy country, that before October 7th, if it had normalized with Israel, it would have been a major blow to the idea of an Arab-Israeli conflict in general. Of course, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would continue, but the Arab-Israeli conflict, you could maybe declare it over in some ways. Now you could, there would still be a big move, but the anger towards Israel, anger is a weak word, towards Israel in so many corners of the world, especially in the Muslim world, is so big that I think normalization with Saudi Arabia would be a big deal, but it would not, move us back to where we were before this war. So I say this with enormous pain, personal pain too. We have to recalibrate our expectations, and a friend of mine put it, we have to look for less awful. Less awful is something to work for, right? It's not inspiring as good, but it's a
beginning.
It's a beginning, and given where we are, it's what we got to do.
What do you think of the, in general, if we talk about it a little bit in depth, the two-state solution? What is the advantage or disadvantage? And what's the Israeli inside politics right now? And regular people think about that. Is that a solution, or is that giving more power to unknown? What is the reaction, short term and long term, in your opinion?
So in the short and medium term, the two-state solution was losing support in Israel before October 7th, and right now it's a political non-starter. So those on the center-left don't use that phrase, and they don't because it's a complete political non-starter. The feeling in Israel is that, so I'm talking about the Israeli side for a moment. There's of course a Palestinian, analog, but on the Israeli side, October 7th proved and reconfirmed for Israelis their worst fears of Palestinian power. That if they give an inch to Palestinians, that would become the forward base for the next attack on Israelis, and that if the Palestinians ever actually were able to have power over Israelis, the absolute worst would happen. And here it was on October 7th, first time since 1948, Arab forces conquered Israeli towns, in this case Palestinian forces, and the absolute worst happened. So many people have said it was sort of reminded Israeli Jews of the Holocaust, but it wasn't just the Holocaust. It was also of the conflict of all the way back to 1929, when this happened in British Palestine, and against Jews, many of them not Zionist, actually old Jewish communities. And so for Israelis, Jewish Israelis, this sort of reconfirmed their absolute worst fears. And fear is such a powerful motivator in terms of political action that for Israelis, it almost became an end to any discussion of, you want me to give something to Palestinians because they promised they won't attack me, forget it. So when Israelis think, for example, of the Gaza Strip, the Jewish towns around the Gaza Strip and villages around the Gaza Strip were the ones who suffered. The West Bank, which would be the bulk of the Palestinian state, neighbors a lot of the Israeli population. From the edge of the West Bank, you can clearly see all of Tel Aviv and the Tel Aviv sort of greater metropolitan area, which is kind of half of the Israeli population. So it's kind of, this would be multiplied by 100, maybe not in the beginning, but eventually either Hamas or someone like Hamas would take over, and Israel would constantly live in that kind of fear. So from the Israeli perspective at the moment, especially with this dramatic fear factor, it's a non-starter. And I say this in part because there's a very long-standing argument that's been made. It's made publicly, in popular terms, but also in academic terms sometimes, that Israel only understands violence, that until it's pushed, it never gives into anything. So in 73, Sadat was able to surprise Israel, and then finally would come around and make peace. And there was some truth to that in 73. But it was partly because Sadat was strategically rather brilliant. He didn't try to actually conquer Tel Aviv, much to the Syrians' dismay. He was trying to push Israel, prove that he can do
Yeah.
this, and then push them towards diplomacy. And he was trying to do it with an eye towards the United States, with a very clear strategic understanding of what he wants and what he doesn't want. Um, so that's one. I think this what you actually see is exactly the reverse. Usually, when you attack someone, anyone, Israelis, Palestinians, anyone, you attack them, they hunker down, and try to fight back at the first thing, make sure of my security, and attack the other before they attack me. That's one. In the longer term, I still believe that there's no other Palestinian independence in some form or another, and I think it probably looks a lot like a two-state solution. I'm not naive. I don't think it's coming anytime soon, and I'm not sure it can look like the two-state solution that was imagined previously. But I want to emphasize one point that's very, very important. A two-state solution was always talked about in these negotiations as a demilitarized Palestinian state. And so, yes, there could still be a threat, and of course, and one has to address that. But it is a very different thing than now establishing a state with an armor core, in the West Bank waiting to storm down onto Tel Aviv. It's a very different thing. And the question, I think, moving forward in a post-October 7th world is, what does that demilitarization actually look like? How can Israelis feel safe in a situation where Palestinians govern themselves? One of the many, many, many tragedies. One of the tragedies of this is that the possibility of reconciliation, I think, is more remote than it ever was. I don't think the sides are eager to reconcile with one another. Palestinians looking at what's happened in Gaza and often feeling it themselves personally are not in the mood now to reconcile and hug Israelis. Israelis feel the same way about Palestinians, absolutely. But let me end on this. When I think about diplomatic solutions, including some form of a two-state solution or Palestinian independence or of a confederation, but one where there's real political separation. Again, we need to lower our standards. We need to think of what would be good in this world, not what would be beautiful harmony in the Holy Land. The whole world looks at that land and thinks, everything, we have to have harmony there. If you look at Cyprus, which is very close by, Cyprus is divided. Nicosia, the capital, European Union capital, by the way, is divided. According to the European Union and most international bodies, occupied. Northern Cyprus occupied by Turkey. The Turks, of course, recognize Northern Cypriot state, republic. So terrible unsolved conflict. There's one difference. How many people have actually died in Cyprus this year or last year or the year before from this conflict? 0. So even if we just aspire towards something more that looks a bit more like Cyprus, where there's a livable situation, where people can pursue their lives, can have a modicum of security and safety for themselves, both sides, and allow themselves to build forward, even if the conflict is not completely resolved, even if harmony is not broken out, even if reconciliation has not been achieved, that's a very, very worthy goal to start with. And I do think that entails necessarily Palestinian political agency that yes, approaches sovereignty. What exactly it looks like and whether we can achieve statehood in short term, I don't know. I do think that's the proper goal, the right goal, and also the practical goal. But a lot can be done along the way, in part because the situation is so bad. So in short, on the Israeli side, right now an unstarter. But that doesn't mean that down the road some things can't look different, and they can't look different, especially if you explain exactly what demilitarization looked like and revisits it. And if there were political change, of course, in Israel, which would be necessary for that, but also among Palestinians. If Israelis saw a not friendly Palestinian leadership, but a reasonable, rational Palestinian leadership with agency that can get things done, that is committed to fighting Hamas or at least to rejecting that kind of path, a lot can be different. We're not turning the clock back, but a lot could be different.
So let me ask you this. One is how much what you said, there's no feel of a two-state solution right now in Israel had to do with the amount of retaliation since October 7th, all these people that died and stuff like that. And you'll be like, you know what? There is no way that they're gonna not want to retaliate back, or get revenge or stuff like that. So because of the amount of destruction happened, that it'd be like impossible that they're gonna forget what we did being Israeli. And on the other side, if you're an Arab leader, how would you, or the person that we're talking about, the one we want to go, how do you make a difference? Like, what's the difference between, resistance or, try to get your occupied parts back? How do you talk to the people that have everybody died in their family and say, hey, we want to make peace with this nation? Like, those are two very hard questions. How would you do that?
So on the first part, I wish that was the case, but I don't think so. So
Okay.
Israelis, and it's really important to emphasize, Israelis and Palestinians, and I think many people in the West have seen and experienced a very, very different reality since October 7th. Israelis and the Hebrew press has lived and relived October 7th every single day. So today, for dead hostages returning, including two very, very young children, that in the Israeli mind is huge. It's a historic event. It's something that Israelis have been living. They all know the names of these kids. Not they. We have been thinking about these particular kids, every day since October 7th. And so when the world was looking at the unfolding war in Gaza and seeing the dead and tens of thousands of dead, including many children and women, of course, that's what they were saying. It's not that Israelis weren't aware that it's happening, but it's not what they were experiencing day to day. And so the very lived experience and lived trauma is a very different one. And that is a very problematic place to start from. So when Israelis think of why couldn't it be possible, they don't think the Palestinians have some right now to be extraordinarily angry at Israel. They attacked Israel in the most horrific way possible. Of course, we had to go after Hamas, and war is absolutely horrific.
No, but they don't
And
think that there's no way there'll be peace because there's bad blood between both
they
sides.
should.
Yeah.
I think so. I do
Yeah.
think so. But I don't think that's what most Israelis are thinking about. Most Israelis feel that they are a victim of this story,
Okay.
and their retaliation was necessary. And of course, Palestinians are the same. They say October 7th, either they don't think it happened or it did happen, or maybe they're completely against it. But that was one day, and since then we've had 16 months of horror. So that creates, I think, a real gap in the way people see it. But it does mean, so I think it's more that when Israelis ask themselves, am I willing to reconcile with these people? No. And Israelis tell themselves a lot that it wasn't only Hamas entering. Hamas entered on October 7th, but then after them there were civilians that came and joined in some of the horrors, and some of the hostages were taken by civilians. So it's a very easy story to tell yourself that this is my ultimate enemy in a sense. And of course for Palestinians, this was reconfirming every fear that they have of Israelis.
Yeah.
Once
That,
Israelis
that's my
have the
point, that they can,
exactly.
yeah, that they won't be like, hey, both sides, like the Israelis, like, I can make peace because, or no two-state solution because this is going to keep going.
Yes, so exactly. I was saying before that for Israelis, this is reconfirming their worst fears of Palestinian power. Of course, for Palestinians, what's their worst fear? That if Israel had a chance again, it would go back to 48 again, and they would be displaced, mass casualties, and they would be displaced again. And here's Trump saying exactly that.
Yeah.
So it reconfirms exactly the fear. So the Palestinians, we give them power, but so I do think that is a big part of it. But I really do think that we have to change our mindset of what we're trying to achieve. Peace. I differentiate between two kinds of peace. There's capital P peace, which is harmony, and it's the people reconciling and agreeing on what really happened and the narrative of what has the last 100 years been and what does it mean. And then there's a small, lowercase p peace, which is people living with each other. It's the absence of war, and I will take that kind any day. That's more similar to Cyprus, but it could be better than Cyprus.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any chance in my lifetime that Palestinians and Israelis agree on the meaning of 1948 or the meaning of the Zionist project or anything. I don't need it. I don't think the Palestinians have to become Zionists. I don't think the Israelis are giving up their Zionism or their idea of national identity. But they do need to find a way to live side by side, and that I think can be done. So I really do think there's an important differentiation there. What does a Palestinian leader say to his own people? So first, I'm not the best person to say that. I'm not Palestinian, and I think there's Palestinians could answer this much better than I could.
But it's pretty much, even if you're Israeli leader, what would you say to your own people after what happened?
I think it's along those lines. I'm not asking you to love them.
Yeah.
If I were, advising a Palestinian leader as a campaign manager, I'd say, don't advocate that Israelis are actually okay, that we should understand October 7th touched on their worst fears. I would say, look, they're there. Do I wish in my wildest dreams that they were not there? Sure. Do I wish that this never had started in the early 20th century? Yes. But they are there. And therefore, we will learn to live peacefully with them out of our self-interest, for us, not for them. And this is also, by the way, the strength of variations of a two-state solution over a one-state solution. The one-state solution, which is no solution at all in my mind, requires deeper reconciliation. It requires people not only to accept that I have to accept that they're here, but to say I'm going to share a country with them, I'm going to build a state with them, maybe I'll have a political party with them and we'll discuss social security with them, or education systems. In a two-state solution or some kind of political separation, which is not human separation, but in political separation, the two parties, each one of them, run their own social security and their own education system, and they tell themselves their own stories, and they have their own national holidays, and they have not given up anything about their national narrative or their victimhood or anything. But they have, and this is a very hard thing to do, come to accept that the other one is here to stay, and we have to accept that, and we have to live peacefully. It's a much lower bar than a one-state solution, much, much lower. So when people say to me two-state solution is impractical, I partially agree. I think it's very, very difficult to get to, certainly in the short term. But a one-state solution that they come with, that's 10 times harder. And so, whether you like the idea or not, sitting in a university in America, that's very nice. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. Whether it's practical for the people living there, asking them, are they going to share a parliament? Are they going to share a government? Let's imagine a parliament of a one-state solution. Hamas is one of the parties.
Yeah.
And you're asking the Israelis to sit in there, and Ben Gvir and Smotrich.
That's
You're
actually
asking
an
Palestinians
amazing
now.
point you just made. The one state solution is much harder than I didn't think
Much
about
harder.
it like that when you said like Hamas would be. You're right. I don't know if
Maybe
they.
a different
I
name, but
don't
it's
think.
Ben.
I don't think they would be or anybody like that would be because the voting process will be different. They won't be
Okay.
forced to vote. But you made a great point.
But someone along those lines. And by the way, not only Hamas, also the most extremist on the Israeli side.
Yeah.
Now the Palestinians in parliament and in society, what if the minister of police is Ben Gvir?
Yeah.
Are they actually going to think they're going to be treated properly? Of course not.
Yeah.
And if Hamas is in charge of the police or anyone else, I can tell you, I can guarantee you that Jewish citizens of this supposed one state, they would fight to protect themselves against this former Hamas leader. So all I'm saying is that the bar is so much higher. And that's to say that, two-state, we need to demystify it. It's not some grand, end of days harmony. It's not that. It's finding a practical political solution that is faulty, that will probably fail at times and can be patched together, but that can allow people to build their lives. And that can allow longer term also for reconciliation. I don't think the French and Germans in 1945 started loving each other. I don't think they forgot what happened 2 minutes earlier. But they built a scenario with a lot of American tanks present. They built a scenario in which they can both start building their lives, and a generation or two later, they just care about that less.
Yeah.
That's the ideal from my perspective.
I think that's a great point. So a couple more questions. The first one is very important. Why in negotiation can have two people like you and me negotiating like we're talking right now? Like why is this we talking about logical things? Obviously, even we agreeing and disagreeing and a lot of things, but we understanding each other. We understanding, the pain of the other people while you not giving up your own ideas and what you want, but willing to negotiate. Why can people behind closed doors that make decisions discuss stuff like we are right now?
Sorry, I was muted. I think partly because we're not under the constraints of leadership and political elections. Let's be honest. It's not that you and I are some pristine, wonderful. I think we're great people, but that's not. If we were politicians and had to get elected in the reality, in this reality, we would also be under incredible constraints. You don't get to a leadership position, especially of peoples with such enormous traumas and challenges, and ongoing challenges, not past traumas. Without speaking to those fears. So um, that's one. And second is, and this relates to this, I don't think it's just a problem of leadership. So we've talked a lot about the need for new leadership, and I think that's very real. And I think leadership can do a lot. But there's always also a danger of overestimating the importance of leadership, which is to say that leaders at the end of the day reflect their publics. So, the best leader in the world can only do so much given a certain public. And when they make a mistake, they may also be removed from that leadership, be killed or something else. It depends on the system, of course, but take now normalization with Saudi Arabia. MBS can do enormous things that no other Saudi leader would do if he decides to do it. But he too is constrained, even though it's not a democracy by any means, and even though he has control of the security apparatus, and I assume he will become king one day.
He's not even the king yet. Yeah, I know.
He's not even the king yet, but I assume he will be in control when his father passes. But still, there's 30-some million people in Saudi Arabia. They have strong feelings. That is partly, I think, why the Palestinian issue is part of normalization. It's not, I don't think, because MBS is obsessed with the Palestinian issue. I think it's because he knows his own public and the Arab world, but also his own public especially. And so all that to say that leaders are constrained by their publics. I think Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders are especially constrained by their publics. Israel because it has a democracy, although under threat. Palestinians precisely because they do have actually democratic mechanisms, and because it's not a state, because they are sort of this revolutionary kind of leadership, organizational leadership. They actually makes them more beholden to a certain degree to their peoples and their constituencies. And therefore, one can talk rationally, and you and I can be friends, and we can live in a society here with none of the constraints. But it's a very different reality there. It's a very different thing. And I really think it's an important point. You put anyone in a different rubric, in a different system, they have very different realities facing them. If you and I got, we're in a reality, if we were living there still, then we would still be in, let's say, the dynamics of fear and the dynamics of, is that my enemy? We're here in a different, very different reality, and so that we don't have it. Still, not to give up on the leadership point, I think a smart leader also understands that leaders not only reflect the public constraints and the public mood, they also shape them. I think Netanyahu, for example, when he decided it can't be the Palestinian Authority, that became a strong talking point in Israel. The Palestinian Authority is a bad idea for Gaza. That was a terrible idea by him. And I think he did it partly for political reasons. And had he from the very beginning decided that's actually a actor that can help us in this process, we might have been in a different scenario, not a good one, but a slightly less bad one, where you would have at least an interlocutor, at least a secular Palestinian actor, very, very faulty one, with whom you could work.
Yeah.
That's a decision that he made, and now it's a public demand, but it's one that he could have shaped too. That's true on the Palestinian side too. If someone were braver to say, Palestinian leader were braver to say to the Palestinians some hard truths about Israel not going anywhere, and some of their demands are not going to happen in their lifetime, but a lot can be achieved, then I think they could have gone a very far way. Instead, old mantras of, they're about to return to Jaffa and Haifa, and it's about to happen. It's not. And Hamas is selling this stuff to them, but it's not about to happen.
Yeah.
And Hamas, I think, thought they were about to beat Israel along with Hezbollah and Iran. They didn't. So it goes both ways, is my point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. Well, I hope the next time we have you will be very soon, and I hope we won't be talking about this. We'll be talking about how
We'll be much
things are,
happier,
are great. Are you and then I'll let you go. This has been amazing and always great to have you. Are you worried about,
Likewise.
the politics of, with the Ukraine, and it seems like Trump is like signing up with strong men again. Are you Does that fear in any way with the new change in the US policy in general, the foreign policy, the whole world? I mean, I feel it's positive in a way that the world need to wake up and be like, we have to do our own shit. We can have like uh America
Daddy
take care of
come in,
everything.
yeah.
But for us Americans, it's bad. But
I am very worried. I think it's not it's a very clear pattern. He is the first president since the Second World War who really does not believe in the post-World War II order. He doesn't want America to underwrite world security. He doesn't want to side with medium and small size allies. He wants to partner with the biggest guys. Ukraine's just a hindrance on the way to cooperating with Russia from his perspective. And that's my impression, at least. I mean, that's a very schematic
Yeah.
and broad brush way of putting it. I think it's a mistake because I think, there's Ukraine and there's Taiwan and there's everyone else. And the world order that America built, it was not just for America's benefit, but it was also in America's benefit. It's also the benefit of many of these different countries. That's why so many of American allies are very, very wary of this. And going along with the strongman, yes, sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes you have to. I said in the Middle East, I think you probably have to right now because there's no one else. But I think forsaking Ukraine, maybe down the road Taiwan, others, is a very bad mistake because it doesn't stop there, right? We know this. It doesn't stop
Yeah.
there. So I am very worried, yeah,
Yeah.
in a broader foreign policy sense.
It's gonna be great. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you,
Everybody should
Hatem.
follow you on Twitter. Where can people find you or follow you?
On Blue Sky or Twitter or LinkedIn, it's Natan Sachs. It's just my name,
And,
Natan Sachs.
and I'll have the link for his info in the description. Thank you so much. Always amazing to
Thanks,
have you.
Hatem.
Great conversation as usual. Appreciate it.
Great to talk.